in the late 1950s, Hammer Films reinvented the Gothic horror movie, and it became the dominant mode of Gothic horror for 10, 15 years thereafter. Their big breakthrough was The Curse of Frankenstein, which was directed by Terence Fisher, written by Jimmy Sangster, starred Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, introduced a whole bunch of other technicians and supporting performers who would then go on in various combinations for almost the rest of Hammer's career as a horror studio, or initial career as a horror studio, we now have to say. It was such a big hit that the same team immediately followed up with Dracula. And then, once you've done Frankenstein and Dracula, there's kind of a quandary as to where you go next. There's this pantheon of horror subjects, and Hammer knocked off all of them. They eventually did a werewolf film and the Phantom of the Opera and a Jekyll and Hyde film. Immediately they made The Hound of the Baskervilles with more or less the same team again, and they started developing a mummy movie. The reason they went with a mummy movie is that they had a distribution deal in America with Universal Pictures, who owned The Mummy. It's not based on a pre-existing book like Dracula or Frankenstein or Hound of the Baskervilles. It's based on a series of films that Universal had made in the 1940s. And while this was around, I mean, Hammer didn't have an exclusive deal with an American distributor or big studio. Warner Brothers had released Dracula in America. And so they were looking around to do hookups with all the majors. And of course, what the majors had were the rights to various properties. And among the people Hammer talked to were Paramount Pictures. Paramount were among the classiest of the Hollywood majors, and they hadn't made many horror films, but they'd made some quite important ones. One of the things that they tended to do in their horror movies was to go with respectable literary subjects. In the 1930s, they had made wonderful versions of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and The Island of Dr. Moreau, which they'd made as Island of Lost Souls. The rights to those were either in the public domain or assigned elsewhere. And so Paramount were looking to their 1940s output. And it actually strikes me as strange. They had two choices. One was The Picture of Dorian Gray, which Hammer never made a version of and would seem to be like an ideal Hammer subject. It fits in perfectly with their worldview and their themes, and you can see, I mean, Peter Cushing couldn't have played Dorian Gray at that point, but he could have played Lord Henry and been brilliant. And you can easily see Christopher Lee playing the stuffy painter, and they would have cast a beautiful young man. I mean, David Peel from Brides of Dracula is kind of a Dorian Gray character, and a starlet as Sybil Vane, and beefed up the lurid stuff, and we'd had a wonderful Bernard Robinson portrait morphing, but they didn't go with Dorian Gray. It was a subject that they stayed away from, and instead they went with a very little known Paramount horror film called The Man in Half Moon Street, which was based on a play by Barry Lyndon, who is slightly better known as a screenwriter than a playwright. He wrote the 1950s version of War of the Worlds, and in the 1940s he wrote The Lodger and Hangover Square, which are sort of blood and thunder Gothic melodramas, very much in the Hammer style. Although oddly, The Man in Half Moon Street has a contemporary setting rather than a Victorian Gothic setting. When Hammer approached it, they set it back in the past. But The Man in Half Moon Street, which starred a Swedish actor called Nils Sasta, is not a particularly well-loved or well-remembered horror film. It's a bit too classy to really click as a scare picture, although it has a great set piece at the end. It's based on a series of rumours about a historical character called the Count of Saint Germain, who was reputed to be an alchemist who lived a very long time. And Lyndon turns this into the story of a surgeon who is also a painter, who through an operation is able to stay young well into his second century, providing he has an operation every 10 years. And of course, the problem with that is that means somebody has to donate the gland. So not only does he have an operation, but people die every 10 years and he moves on. And the set piece, spoiler if you've not seen any of these versions, is at the end, it all goes wrong and he catches up with his missing years, very much like the end of Dracula or the end of She. So you have a rapid aging sequence at the end, which is your horror set piece, and is quite effectively done in the Paramount film. But it's a piece of work that you look at it and you think, I can see that there are the makings of a Hammer film in there. Of course, it's given to Jimmy Sangster, who was their screenwriter at the time. Rather peculiarly, the setting is changed from London to Paris. Originally, the film was going to be called The Man in Rune Noir, but then changed to The Man Who Could Cheat Death, which is sort of more lurid, I suppose. The setting was moved back from the 1940s to the 1890s. And for reasons that's really hard to see, the character is changed from a painter to a sculptor. And it was set to go as yet another in the reteaming of the old gang, which was by then Terence Fisher, Jimmy Sangster, Peter Cushing, Christopher Lee. Peter Cushing was cast as the central character, who has a different name in every single version of this story. He's Dr. Carrel in the 1940s, and he's Georges Bonnet in this version. But Cushing was not a particular fan of Sangster as a screenwriter. He did make a couple of films around this time that Sangster wrote, Revenge of Frankenstein and Brides of Dracula. But in both cases, he personally recruited another writer to come in and he said do additional dialogue. What he meant was make his lines better. Also, he had just made like 4 films in a row and he was signed up to do a whole bunch more, so he pled exhaustion and backed out of it. So Hammer Films have this key Hammer project ready to go, but they don't have their reliable star. Looking back on it, it's hard to realise just how important Peter Cushing was to the first run of Hammer films. Even though Christopher Lee is in all of the others, even though he plays Dracula in Dracula and the monster in Frankenstein, he was still not thought to be a star. Hammer didn't give him top billing until a couple of pirate movies in the early 60s. And they didn't really treat him as a horror star until he came back as Dracula in Dracula Prince of Darkness. So rather than bump Christopher Lee up to the lead role, which would seem to be the obvious thing to do now, and Lee would have been great as the Man Who Could Cheat Death, they looked around for somebody else to play the part. And Anton Diffring had just played Frankenstein for a Hammer TV pilot called Tales of Frankenstein. So he'd already stepped in for Peter Cushing once. And even more strangely, Anton Diffring had just played the man in Half Moon Street in a British TV live production, sadly now lost. And so he knew the role. And so he basically came in and recreated his role. One of the other actors from the TV version, Arnold Marl, who plays the old Viennese professor, who's sort of the conscience of the main character, had also been in the TV version. Arnold Marl, strangely, had been in the TV version and the Hammer film version of The Abominable Snowman in the same role as well. So he was obviously used to hanging around and reciting the same old lines again. Hazel Court, who had been the leading lady of The Curse of Frankenstein, came in and was the leading lady in this, and actually I think has a slightly better role in this. She looks absolutely beautiful and astonishing in that wonderful, lurid late 1950s colour. Rumours persist that she's slightly more naked in a continental version of this film, but unlike the longer version of Dracula, which did finally turn up, nobody seems to have found the version with the topless shots, although I'm sure people have been looking for a very long time. And I think the upshot was probably about as effective and successful as it could have been under the circumstances. They lost their leading man. There were some underlying problems with the original story that, although Jimmy Sangster tarts it up a bit, he doesn't really address. It's still slightly too stuffy for a horror film, although he puts more lurid stuff in it. Anton Diffring never really won. Yeah, he was not elevated to being another Peter Cushing. He wasn't a great horror star, although he made a bunch of horror films. He went on from The Man Who Could Cheat Death to Circus of Horrors, which is a film built entirely around him, and in fact has a very similar ending to The Man Who Could Cheat Death. In both films, his character dies because of a vengeful woman he is mutilated early on in the movie, comes back and brings about his doom, or contributes to his doom, rather. Anton Diffring was already typecast in British films as our leading Nazi. He's in stuff like The Colditz Story. He had spent the whole of the 1950s in Nazi uniform in British war films, playing the fiendish Hun. He specialised in sadistic SS officers. Must have really annoyed him because he personally was a refugee from the Nazis. He was a gay man who got out of town to avoid having a pink triangle slapped on him. He probably... The film that's closest to what he was really like is I Am a Camera, the 1950s film of Cabaret, in which he plays a Jewish playboy who's persecuted by the Nazis. That's much more like the way he really was. And in that, actually, he's kind of fun and charming, as people who knew him say he really was. But his screen image is much closer to the character he plays in The Man Who Could Cheat Death, who is kind of cold, remote, removed, icy, chilly, hard to like, in the way Peter Cushing is likable even when he plays Baron Frankenstein. He's sort of charming when evil. There's something about Diffring that's really hard to warm up to as a monster, and it sort of works. He's a scary character in this, even when he has to wear some very peculiar green makeup for the monster scenes. But he's not a particularly engaging character in the way that Peter Cushing is. So it's sort of hard to stay with him for the whole film. The whole film really does depend on him. And I think it is purely the lack of Peter Cushing that has relegated The Man Who Could Cheat Death to the sort of position of being minor Hammer. The Mummy, for instance, is a similarly quite ramshackle script, but Peter Cushing just lifts it. Yeah, he makes this frankly silly story work. And of course The Mummy has The Mummy. The Mummy is a much more iconic character than The Man Who Could Cheat Death. There haven't been like 4 or 5 Man Who Could Cheat Death sequels. Although in the 1970s, Richard Matheson did actually sort of revive the character in The Night Stalker, which was the second in the series of films featuring Darren McGavin as Carl Kolchak, the monster-fighting reporter. He'd taken out a vampire in The Night Stalker. And then he went on to The Night Strangler, in which Richard Anderson plays a character who's very like The Man Who Could Cheat Death. It's the same old gland transplants, and it even has the same, crumble to death ending. So this film isn't quite a dead end in the history of horror, but it didn't really open up a whole new mythology either. But there is a sort of upside to this, is that if you're a horror fan or a Hammer fan, you're less likely to have seen this so many times that you know every single lick of it. Yeah, there's still a great deal of sort of charm and fun to be had with it, even the sillier aspects. And I certainly think the bubbling green potion in a safe, with which is has a little green light bulb above it to make it look more sinister, is the sort of thing you'd expect from the Nutty Professor rather than the serious horror film. I actually really like the very British version of sort of Parisian high life in the 1890s. It's very lumpy. There's a wonderfully kind of beef-faced actor called Dennis Shaw who plays a Parisian lout in the layabout scenes, and there's a nice little humorous sequence with a drunken, disgraced doctor with shaky hands, who Anton Diffring doesn't want to perform an operation on him. So it has little surprises and little treasures that you might not get from the Hammer films that you've seen dozens of times. Considering that they were medium budget British films, and that's being generous, they are extraordinarily beautifully crafted. Okay, you do see the same anatomical diagrams on the wall here that you see in the Frankenstein films, and there is a sense that the laboratory has just been broken up and put back in a different order. But that's part of the charm too, I think, for long-term Hammer fans. So let's just say that it's nice that the man who could cheat death has cheated obscurity as well.